The main portion of my lecture tonight will be concerning the arguments for and against the existence of God. For those viewers who have read a great deal about what atheism is and know the definitions of atheism, I would suggest, unless they are interested in a review, that they skip down to the arguments. I am gratefully indebted to many atheist scholars for the brilliant arguments they have developed to counter theistic proponents, and which I will discuss this evening. My references are in the book list, footnotes, and bibliography at AtheistScholar.org. Some of my sources are Michael Martin, Peter A. Angelis, Quentin Smith, Michael Tooley, B.L. Mackey, Theodore Drange, and Andrea Weisberger. What is atheism? Atheism eliminates the need for intermediary aid to interpret the world for us and to make prescriptive demands for moral and ethical practices based on supernatural and superstitious premises. Atheists have made up their minds that there is no God, no heaven, and no immortal soul that lives on after death, and therefore no punishment or reward in an imaginary afterlife. Atheists are both intelligent and brave. They are intelligent for having thought their way out of a false religious concept in which our American culture is saturated, and brave because of the social penalties exacted by a religious society on non-believers. There is a premise that atheism is not a philosophy, that it is simply not a belief in God. That is true. But why should atheists stop with that designation and define atheism with one more negative? Theists denigrate us by attempting to characterize atheists as immoral, unhappy, and adrift. Such obstructionist myths need to be contradicted. We are people who have left behind, as children leave toys and fairy tales behind when they grow up, false comfort, myth, and confused moral mandates. Atheists are free, non-credulous, and capable of making choices based on logic, reason, and reality. We are thinkers who exercise the faculty of thought every day and face the challenges of life with joy and resolve. Free choice is a complex, nuanced endeavor. We make our own meaning in a world we comprehend with our reason. Some have charged that our stance has brought about a disenchantment of the world. We can answer such a fatuous phrase by admitting, yes, we see the world as it is. There are earthquakes, tsunamis, predatory creatures, great social injustice and suffering, and people who die terrible deaths. We know that blind chance can cut us or our loved ones down. Atheists do not have the necessity to be comforted for such evils by believing that an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, all-beneficent God will justify them on the day of judgment. We do not need to believe that when we die, we will achieve understanding of the Creator's motives and all evil will be answered for. We know that there is no justification for the evil and inequity in the world. Many atheists instead do their part in trying to make this world, the only one we have, and their lives, mortal and limited, flourish and reach their full potential. We attempt to bring this condition about by giving our full attention to helping create a civil society in our countries and to making a world beneficial to all the species on the planet. We are not distracted by thoughts and actions supporting a theistic fantasy. Our skepticism is invaluable for seeing all the ways we have been seduced, cajoled, and educated into believing that the correct stance is one of acceptance of the majority opinion. In the United States, the majority retains a belief in God and the afterlife. But no group can decide what is best for individual people. It is an insidious position that society and certain religious groups and people take, acting as though they are parents or lawgivers to other adults. What to some fear-filled minds are considered forbidden or prohibitive things, atheists consider rationally and decide to do or not to do based on reason. We do not see people as bad or with wicked natures, but rather as people who have strong competing wants and the desire to reach the truth in their own fashion and in their own time. We do not need to accept other conceptions of truth that we believe to be incorrect, but we do not find it necessary to humiliate people for beliefs that we consider archaic, confused, and superstitious. Our reliance on science and naturalism need not preclude an interrogation of the human heart, what love and tenderness are, and how we are to behave with regard to our fellow man and other species. Atheism is more powerful than the impulse to humiliate. It is important to put our ideas forward in a manner that dispels confusion rather than adds to it. Atheists can relate to their contemporaries with kindness, tolerance, and reason. We can be examples in a world of darkness and chaos. Atheists determine what the good life is for ourselves and the means by which we achieve it. Some of us devote our lives to bringing up children with minds full of the joy of life, unfettered by theistic biblical tales of blood, guilt, and fear. Some of us teach our young people, bringing them to an understanding of the workings of our planet and the evolution of our human species. Some of us are doctors, computer programmers, auto mechanics, physicists, and philosophers. Whatever means we choose, we respond intelligently and compassionately to the imperatives of our society. Many of us devote time and money to atheist organizations, which promote a naturalist worldview and work to keep a wall between our country's church and state. We are atheists, and we know that every goal and every resolution is right here, right now. It is not only theists who have a monopoly on faith, hope, and charity. We atheists live our lives with such premises as well. Our faith is in the ability of human beings to fashion their own moral codes based on reason and human well-being. Our hope is that each individual will reach the highest potential of meaning and happiness. Our charity is in working toward helping humans and other species in less fortunate circumstances. By living our lives with an understanding of science and with compassion and hard work, we atheists believe we can someday bring about societies where all beings will reach their finest capacities and where lives and minds will flourish. Definitions of atheism. Michael Martin, the preeminent atheist philosopher, defines two types of atheism in his volume. Atheism, a philosophical justification. There is negative atheism, which is the position of not believing a theist God exists. There is positive atheism, the position of disbelieving a theist God exists. In a broad sense, negative atheism means an absence of belief in any God or gods. In a broad sense, positive atheism is a belief in no gods. Here are the definitions used by Douglas Kruger in What is Atheism, 1998, for types of belief stances. Theism is a belief that there exists exactly one God, and this God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and transcendent. This God is also active in the world. The traditional God is the God of theism. Deism is a belief that there exists one God with all the attributes stated in theism above. But this God is not active in the world. Polytheism is a belief that at least two gods exist, none of which is the God of theism. Atheism is a belief that there are no gods. Richard Dawkins, the well-known atheist and biologist, defines strong theism to strong atheism on a numerical basis of 1 to 7. Agnostics fall in the middle at numbers 3, 4, and 5. The impartial agnostic stands at exactly 50% and believes that God's existence and non-existence are exactly equiprobable. Arguments for and against the existence of God. There are 3 consequential arguments concerning the existence of God and 2 arguments that are serious challenges against God's existence. The first 3 arguments are the ontological, cosmological, and teleological. The Kalam argument is a variation on the cosmological. The two substantial arguments against God's existence is the argument of evil in the world, both moral and physical, and the argument from unbelief. The lecture will discuss the above arguments with a glance at the additional array of assertions about God's existence. The somewhat dated ontological, cosmological, and teleological arguments have been defeated by atheologists many times, but as with the tenets of the creationism movement, theist philosophers dust the dated ideas off, revise them slightly, and bring them back again and again. The problem of or from evil is defended by theists with new twists and turns to their propositions. They are quite aware of the formidable challenge of justifying an all-powerful, omniscient, and all-benevolent God who is concerned about and active in a world and yet allows it to contain evil. The extensive books and papers, as well as the intellectual prowess of the opponents on both sides of the philosophical debate over God's existence, demonstrate the intense interest and the high stakes involved. Yet the opinion of Julian Baggini, author of Atheism, A Very Short Introduction, 2003, is both contrarian and thoughtful. Baggini describes the God existence propositions as a form of argument called apologetics. The function of such arguments is not to prove that God really exists, but to demonstrate that the belief that he does is not irrational or unwarranted. We will be going over and over this again tonight. Theologians try to establish that belief in God is consistent with logical and philosophical evidence. This lecture will not only discuss the major arguments for the existence of God, but glance at some of the lesser theories. The book list at AtheistScholar.org, What is Atheism?, suggests some volumes for the atheist scholar, ranging from the most accessible for the beginners to the more technically complex books for readers who have some background in philosophy. The ontological argument has a long history. Michael Martin, the preeminent atheist philosopher of our time, plots a course for its beginnings from the theologian Anselm in the 11th and 12th centuries to its continuance up to Alvin Plantinga, arguably the most sophisticated and knowledgeable contemporary theist philosopher. The general argument consists of 1, God is a completely perfect being, and 2, existence in external reality is necessary for God to be the completely perfect being, because if he did not exist externally, he would be lacking something, actual existence, and would not be the completely perfect being which he is. Therefore, God exists. The terms used to describe the God of the ontological argument generally consist of all-powerful, omnibenevolent, omniscient, and so on. Colin McGinn, the famous atheist philosopher, has pointed out that one problem with the ontological argument is that the term perfect and all attributes used to describe God need to be defined. What do they really mean, and what properties would they entail? In reality, the only way we can apprehend God's perfection is through our cultural sources and our psychological predilections. Why would humans worship a God that is not perfect, yet who is ostensibly perfect by definition? God could not be called God if he were not the completely perfect being. There is circularity to the argument too, as it begins with the assumption that a God exists and circles back to the original proposition. Michael Martin has pointed out that any word could be substituted for God, such as fairy, elf, or island. Plantinga and other theist philosophers assert that their propositions for the existence of God need only be rationally acceptable and not contrary to philosophic reason. Martin rather humorously states that declaring the word fairy, island, or elf as a perfect being is as rationally acceptable and not contrary to philosophic reason as the word God. Arthur Schopenhauer, the well-known atheist philosopher of the 19th century, thought the ontological argument, at best, a charming joke. the ontological argument fails. The lecture's discussion of the cosmological argument will refer to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, the second way, which is generally considered Aquinas' strongest argument or proof of God. Here is a concise summation of the rather complex argument, which is often stated with 5 or 6 propositions. Everything had a beginning. Everything that began has a beginner. Since the universe was beginning, it had to have a beginner, and we call that beginner God. A variation on the cosmological argument is very popular with some contemporary theologians. It was revived from the formulations of Arab medieval theologians. It is known as the Kalam cosmological argument, which involves the idea of a necessary being. The Kalam argument states that there are now contingent beings. Either they always existed, going back to the past infinitely, or they began at some point. Since they say it is impossible that there was a chain back to the past infinitely, being had to begin at some point. If something begins to exist, they say, it has a cause. The only possible cause is a necessary being, and therefore a necessary being exists, which is God. Another way of stating the cosmological argument is 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. And 3. Therefore the universe had a cause. This definition of the cosmological argument is used by William Lane Craig. Craig is a well-known theist proponent who published the Kalam cosmological argument in 1979. Quentin Smith states that there have been more articles in the philosophy journals concerning the Kalam concept than any other contemporary philosopher's formulation of God's existence, including the concepts of Plantinga and Swinburne. There are many objections to the cosmological argument. Infinite regress is logically possible, and despite their claims, theist theologians have not proved its impossibility. Even if the premise of a first cause is accepted, that does not prove the first cause needed to be the theist God. Logically, even if there were a first cause, there is no reason to necessarily believe that first cause still exists. There could have been some finite God that has ceased to exist. The first cause need not be omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, or even conscious. The cause could be the universe itself, or as some physicists now think, something came from nothing. Another buttress of the theist philosophers is the principle of sufficient reason from Aristotle, the 5th century Greek philosopher. The principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, is invoked in defense of cosmological arguments, particularly the Kalam. The simplest definition of the PSR is that there must always be a reason that suffices to explain anything that is. Leibniz, in his Monadology, 1714, states that there is a PSR and that most frequently the reason cannot be known by us. The principle of sufficient reason today is in serious trouble. Quantum mechanics and the PSR would seem to be in conflict. Indeterminacy is characteristic of many quantum physics processes. Douglas Kruger maintains that the PSR cannot be shown to be true by either observation or by experience. The cosmological argument, including its subsidiary, the Kalam cosmological argument, fails. The last of the 3 consequential arguments for God's existence is the teleological, or the argument from design. Michael Martin maintains that there is a great deal of similarity between the teleological and the cosmological formulations, and that there is really no sharp distinction between them. The teleological argument is very weak. First formulated in its present form by William Paley, who wrote Natural Theology, 1802, it claimed that when one sees a complex mechanism, such as a watch, one assumes it had a maker. Therefore, since the universe is complex, we can assume it also had a maker. We can therefore assume the universe's maker is God. But the universe is natural, not a machine, and has natural causes. If one reads Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker, 1987, one will learn how evolution accounts for the design we find. Recent attempts to find design, such as concepts concerning a fine-tuned universe, have been unconvincing. The eminent physicist Victor Stenger's God, the Failed Hypothesis, 2007, is an excellent account of natural processes. Stenger consistently demonstrates that the universe behaves very much as one can expect if there were no divine being guiding it. Stenger states, indeed, Earth and life look just like as they can be expected to look if there is no designer God. The argument from design fails. Other arguments for and against the existence of God. It is apparent from the arguments for God and the failure of the propositions that theists begin from the position that God exists. From that point, intelligent theists, such as Alvin Plantinga, develop arguments for God's existence that do not try to prove the arguments are true, but instead rationally logical. Unfortunately, even though the new formulations prove to be as unsound as former ones, atheologists must deal with the most current theist arguments and defeat them. There is an array of lesser arguments of interest to many atheists, and this lecture will list some that still have currency in the debate between the proof or disproof of God's existence. Here are just a few arguments for the existence of God. There is the argument from mind, or the concept that since humans have consciousness, it was bestowed by God. Some theists believe materialism does not give a true account of mental phenomena, and this failure is implicit proof of their position. Their contention is easily struck down by the contemporary findings of biology, psychology, and neuroscience. There is the moral argument, which states that since everyone agrees on right and wrong, God exists as he has created objective moral values. There are other factors that account for objective morality, if indeed such objective morality proves to be the case, which is not clear. First, atheist standards are not incompatible with morality. Second, people can arrive at moral standards out of self-interest, not lying, stealing, and murdering at will. Moral chaos will not result from lack of belief in God. Finally, what kind of absolute moral standard has theism provided us? Religions vary in their moral precepts, and there is much disagreement on moral rules among those who practice the same religion. Tom Flynn states the interesting fact that Christian thought on the death penalty ranges from the wish for complete abolition of the penalty to death for working on the Sabbath or practicing homosexuality. Moral argument fails. The esteemed theist philosopher Alvin Plantinga has an ingenious argument for God's existence. He has many, but we will deal only with this one before we arrive at his attempt to rebut atheologists concerning the problem of the existence of God and the presence of evil. Plantinga cites basic belief. He states that belief in the theist God is properly basic belief. He claims that like simple perceptual beliefs and mathematical beliefs, it is rationally held. There is that rationally held again. We'll keep coming to it time after time. He does not prove God's existence, just attempts to prove that it is not irrational to believe in God. However, atheologists point out that this kind of argument leaves room for conflicting beliefs and does not exclude beliefs in magic, astrology, and other such basic beliefs very common to humans. Plantinga's argument fails. There are the arguments from miracles and the argument from the Bible. We shall address these issues as we segue into the arguments for the non-existence of God. A few arguments for God's non-existence. There is the anti-creation argument. God supposedly created the universe, but God is immutable. To create the universe, the creator must undergo a state change. An immutable substance cannot undergo a state change. Therefore, God did not create the universe and does not exist. The argument from non-belief was formulated around 1993 in its present form and has been refined by Theodore Drange, who believes it is more robust than the argument from evil. The argument from non-belief states that it seems impossible that a God so involved with man and wishing to see every person believe in him before he or she dies would permit so many people to disbelieve in him. We shall return to this argument later in the lecture, because it is becoming very likely that Professor Drange and other thinkers have arrived, at least temporarily, with an argument even more conclusive than the problem of evil that states the non-existence of God. At this point, we will look at some of the most substantial, if minor, arguments against the existence of God, and will save the problem of evil and the problem of non-belief for more detailed consideration. These are the two most powerful arguments against the existence of God and deserve a thorough discussion. Theists must deal with the argument from confusion. The God of the Christian evangelicals is purported to be a deity who places great emphasis on truth. Why then, if truth is of particular importance to the Christian God, is there such confusion concerning important, in fact, vital issues such as God's laws and the proper behavior to assure salvation in the afterlife among the different religions and sects? There is significant disagreement among Christians, which has so often led to quarrels, schisms, and bloodshed, not to mention torture and banishment of so-called heretics. Why does the Christian God allow such confusion to continue? If this God, who is purportedly all-powerful and all-beneficent, exists, why has he permitted dissension and confusion among his followers for so many centuries? The argument from confusion is a very salient one because of the wide range of conflict and confusion among the many Christian denominations. We just mentioned that the Christians cite the argument from the Bible, inerrant and interpreted by inspired men of God, as proof of God's existence. Well, atheists argue from Bible defects, as this is a very easy rebuttal to theist claims. The Bible is believed by evangelical and other Christians to be the principal form of God's revelation to humans. Of course, they hedge, saying that the Bible is to be interpreted by the aforementioned inspired men. But why does God allow his revelation to be so consummately flawed? The Bible is riddled with textual flaws, technical and scientific inaccuracy, prophetic howlers, and its ethical defects are long and numerous. Why did politics play such an important role in including and omitting whole books of the Bible? Why are the originals for both the Old Testament and the New Testament non-existent, and why are there missing parts? Please see AtheistScholar.org Biblical Criticism for particulars concerning all the issues I have just enumerated. The men who have been so-called inspired by God to interpret the Bible properly profoundly disagree with each other. There is an inference that such a deity believed in by evangelicals is non-existent. There is the argument from human insignificance. The God of the evangelical Christians is supposed to have a very significant interest in human beings. If that is so, why is the planet humans inhabit, the earth, so minuscule in relation to the universe, and why is the time span so long from the length of the universe's existence with regard to the length of human existence? The next two arguments are very similar. They are the anti-creation argument and the transcendent person argument. The anti-creation argument, simply put, is this: time is, as pointed out by scholars, an essential component of the universe. Nothing could have existed prior to time. So how could God exist before time and yet be within time? That argument can be expanded to the transcendent person argument, which is slightly easier to understand. In order for God to create the universe, he would have had to be outside time and space, in other words, transcendent. With both these arguments, God supposedly created the universe, but God is immutable. To create the universe, the creator must undergo a state change. An immutable substance cannot undergo a state change. Therefore, God did not create the universe and does not exist. But God is supposed to be personal, to exist within time and space. In the Bible, he walks among humans, talking and interacting with them. A personal being existing within time and space cannot create time and space. Theists have put forth the idea that God is part transcendent and part personal. The transcendent part created everything, including time and space, and the personal part interacts with men and matter. But to the scientific mind, this concept of two matters for the same entity becomes incomprehensible. How can a being who is personal have thoughts without a brain? Scientists have found that brain damage alters or erases thoughts. So when God is thinking, there is a scientific assumption that this personal entity must have a brain. How could he have a human brain if he is transcendent, having nothing to do with matter? How can he not have one if he is personal, having everything to do with matter? Scholars find this a strong argument, but they agree that it is unlikely to impress people who have had little scientific training. There is the incoherence of omnipotence argument, which is very clever and amusing. Can God, being omnipotent, make a stone which is too heavy for him to lift? Can God, if he wishes, commit suicide since he is omnipotent? But then how can such a being be considered eternal? Such arguments become very detailed and complicated, but the two examples I have just given underscores the incoherence of God's omnipotence. There is, as Colin McGinn, the atheist philosopher, has pointed out, something wrong with the definition of all the terms used to describe God in the ontological argument. Theist philosophers have been pushed, as I mentioned earlier, into the position of not demonstrating the truth of their God's existence, but argue rather that belief in him is not logically unwarranted. Hence Alvin Plantinga's title to his 3-volume magnum opus, Warranted Christian Belief, 2000. But one can see that with each of the past arguments for God's existence that we have perused, there is always one objection, at least, to Christian claims. The lack of evidence argument is a very cogent one, which certainly has influenced many people wavering in their belief. If the God of the Christians is to be accepted, then it is also necessary to view this God as deeply involved with humans, loving and caring for them. There is also an inference that perhaps God wants his love reciprocated. Why then does God not appear and interact with those beings he is said to love? There is only biblical evidence for God's interaction with humans, and as we have discussed, the Bible is so riddled with errors, mistranslations, and flaws that it cannot be taken as evidence for anything but the incompetence or dishonesty of scribes and their superiors. Why doesn't God interact with us in the present day? Some theists would argue that God does exist as the religious experiences human beings undergo. But of course, religious experience, for the time being at least, is not testable, being subjective. Why has God not given us objective evidence of his reality? Most secular people do not understand why a subjective experience should be more telling than objective evidence made public and obvious to everyone. Secular philosophers also cite the argument from Incoherence, which can go on ad infinitum. There are too many contradictions offered in the concept of the Christian God. I will give just a few examples, and for others, I refer my viewers to the bibliography and book list in AtheistScholar.org, What is Atheism? Arguments for and against the existence of God. One uncomplicated incoherence is the Bible's reference to Jesus. The Bible makes the implication that Jesus is God's Son and that Jesus is God. Also that God is love and that God is a spirit. Then the second is the theist claim that God is perfection, and yet this perfection created the universe. However, perfection can have no wants, while it stands to reason, secular reason at any rate, that a creator must have some desires. A third example of incoherence centers around the perfection issue also. God is claimed to be perfect, and at the same time, theists claim that such a perfection loves humanity. To love humanity, however, is to feel some disappointment, which is impossible for perfection. There are more incoherencies. If God is omniscient, then he has knowledge of all the aspects of lust, greed, rage, and so on. But the description of God is that he is morally perfect. Therefore, it is easy to see the contradiction. Which concept is correct? Additionally, God cannot be all-knowing and disembodied. How can God know how to swim if he is disembodied? At least knowing how to swim in what is termed the procedural sense, having the skill to swim. One must have a body for this. God cannot in any sense be all-knowing and disembodied. And of course, omniscience and omnipotence contradict themselves also. If God is all-powerful, he cannot experience rage, frustration, and despair, because these feelings are obviously a feeling of lack of power and control. If he is omniscient, he will have knowledge of such feelings. He cannot be omniscient and omnipotent at the same time. One of the most telling of the incoherencies that theists have great trouble rebutting is that of mathematical entities, the relations between and among them, as philosophers state. This realm of mathematics is infinite. If God were omniscient, he would know all there is to know concerning mathematical facts, and there would be no facts he did not know. But he cannot know these because they are infinite. He is not omniscient, say many secular philosophers, and since God by theist standards must be omniscient, he cannot exist. The complexities of the incoherency argument for God's non-existence are very cogent. Theist arguments for God's existence fail. Theists cite miracles as proof of God's existence, but that great thinker of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, has demolished the argument for miracles. His Of Miracles, 1748, part 10 of an inquiry concerning human understanding, is still a standard for many beginning philosophy classes and is often published on its own. Hume is not arguing against the idea that miracles occur. Rather, he argues that we really do not have a good reason to believe that such miracles as reported really have occurred. He points out that miracles involve the violation of the laws of nature. This being the case, no matter what so-called evidence is brought forward in favor of belief in miracles, is usually inadequate, especially since it usually emanates from testimony. Hume simply states that all the evidence of whatever kind collected by men in support of the laws of nature, and even in his century there was a great deal of evidence collected in support of nature, is necessarily evidence against the occurrence of the miracle or any event that violates the laws of nature. A Jesuit objected to Hume's statement, saying that it could not be valid because it defeated belief in latter-day miracles. If so, it could also be used against the gospel. When Hume heard this objection, we are told he only smiled. Hume concludes his essay with this famous saying, "Whoever is moved by faith to assent to the Christian religion is conscious of a continual miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience." Most thinking people are quite aware that Hume is being heavily sarcastic here, but there are still theists who find such a conclusion a matter for celebration. Our lecture has just glanced at the multitude of arguments for and against the existence of God. The atheist reader who wants to study further in this particular area, as I have said before, will find more arguments on AtheistScholar.org in the book list of what is atheism. The problem of evil. The problem of evil is one of the two most consequential arguments for the non-existence of God, and both theists and atheologists have devoted extensive time and thought concerning its ramifications. The atheist sees a world filled with enormous suffering, both moral and physical. Atheists cannot reconcile suffering, whether from man's moral evil or from natural evil, such as typhoons, earthquakes, cancer, and so on, with an all-powerful, all-benevolent, all-knowing God. As Epicurus, the Hellenistic Greek philosopher, stated, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" The argument is not considered philosophically sound, however. There are possible reasons, according to theist philosophers, for the world being a better place because of the evil in it. One of the theists' favorite justifications is that evil might be necessary in the world to allow people to develop spiritually. Michael Tooley states that the problem of evil should be formulated in a different way by atheist thinkers. He believes in making the more modest claim that some evils exist in the world that make it very unlikely that God exists. Theist philosophers, knowing the strength of atheist arguments that a world containing evil lessens the probability of God, have formulated justifications for the presence of evil, which are called theodicies. A few of their reasons for evil in the world are as punishment for original sin, as a character builder, as an opportunity for earning eternal reward or punishment after death, man's limited knowledge as to God's purpose for evil, the fact of evil suggests an ethical law, and more. They have set the bar even higher against atheist reasoning with the claim that to dispute evil, one would have to consider every one of the theistic arguments. Alvin Plantinga, arguably the most knowledgeable and preeminent theist philosopher, states that the atheist would be obliged to consider all the sorts of reasons natural theologians have invoked in favor of theist beliefs. The traditional cosmological, teleological, and ontological arguments, for example. Plantinga does not explain why he mentions the cosmological argument. There is no necessity in the cosmological for the object, the first cause, in other words, God, to have a moral character or to be morally perfect. The cosmological, therefore, would have no bearing on the fact of evil in the world. His statement makes very little sense. It seems he is trying to muddy the waters by insisting that the atheist philosopher must deal with every argument brought forward by theists, or perhaps he is merely hoping that he is making things too difficult for the atheologist. Alvin Plantinga's argument concerning evil is the most consequential one in contemporary theological circles. He has advanced the free will defense and argues that the concept of an all-powerful, all-benevolent, omniscient God can be compatible with evil in the world. Plantinga is very clever, and while his defense is considered sophisticated by theist philosophers, it does not appear plausible to atheists. A short glance around the web discovers theist agreement with Plantinga, and some seem to believe that his formulations and the recent, what they call scientific discoveries of design, has settled the question of the existence of God. An attenuated version of Plantinga's argument is as follows. Free will is so important for the development of moral creatures that God could not actualize a world without actualizing evil within it. God could simply not create a world with no evil or creatures that would be incapable of choosing evil. Here is Plantinga on the issue. It is possible that God, even being omnipotent, could not create a world with free creatures who would never choose evil. Furthermore, it is possible that God, even being omnibenevolent, would desire to create a world which contains evil if moral goodness requires free moral creatures. Although this argument does not seem robust to many atheist thinkers, Plantinga has managed to create a defense concerning moral evil. He has devised a fallback answer to the problem of physical evils such as earthquakes and tsunamis as well. He states that it is possible that physical evil is caused by Satan or other evil creatures who have free will in some way that does not contradict God's omnipotence. Platinga does admit that the probability of such creatures is extremely low. Richard Swinburne, a formidable Christian theologian in his own right, disagrees with the evil creature idea, stating that it adds an unnecessary proposition to the theory and lowers the probability of the preceding argument. However, many theist philosophers have pronounced the question of evil settled by Platinga, even though the entire argument is open to dispute. Platinga's goal is to logically defeat the idea that God and evil in the world are incompatible. Even if his defense is highly implausible, it is what theists consider a possible answer concerning the compatibility of God's existence and the existence of evil. That possibility is sufficient for Platinga's purposes. It is not necessary for his formulation to be true, but that it is logically possible. In the last volume of his trilogy on belief, Warranted Christian Belief, 2000 to 2009, Platinga devotes the final chapter to suffering and evil once more and states his position that there is perhaps no good anti-theist case from evil. But this defense of free will ultimately fails. Would not awareness of how things really are, if people are to be saved, help them make the correct decision with their free will? Is this not particularly true if one needs the right belief in order to be saved? Such an assumption is supported by the Bible, Mark 16, 15, 16, John 13, 8, 36, 14, 6, and Acts 4, 12. These passages all have to do with belief and its necessity for salvation in the afterlife. There is no other way, according to these passages, that a human can be saved. The benefits to both God and unbelievers would be enormous. Here are some of the benefits of awareness cited by scholars. Unbelievers would get into a proper relationship with God and lose their, according to theists, alienation and depression, and get a sense of meaning in their lives. God too would benefit because more people would come to love and praise him, and the Bible tells us that God deeply desires love and praise. I interject here. When he is disobeyed and not loved and praised, God frequently acts like an enraged, spoiled child in the Old Testament. A spoiled child with the power to wipe out cities and people, which he sometimes does when very angry. According to theists and not atheist moralists, people who came to a belief in God would more likely help people and be more moral and loving toward their fellow human beings. Secular thinkers will either smile ironically at this last statement or become angry, as belief in God has not been seen to improve believers' behavior to their fellow men. In fact, it has seemed to spur them on to persecute others, start holy wars, and to torture and kill those who think differently from them. And now we have arrived at a vexing point. The free will defense seems rather fatuous, not only from the point of view of morals, but also from the point of view of making decisions. People generally do not use their wills in belief acquisition, as Platinga and Swinburne, both formidable theologians, should be aware of. Rational people usually rely on available evidence. Another salient point is that most people would want to know the truth, so they would not be forced against their free will to accept evidence they were shown. And if theists assume that God exists, why would they deny that believing in God could make people freer, opening options to them that they had previously not considered? Free will may be vital for humans, but neither Platinga or other theist philosophers have proved that God helping people come to belief with solid evidence of his existence would truly interfere with their free will. While there may be no obvious philosophical objection to Platinga's theory of moral evil, it is quite clear that he has not even solved the problem of physical evil in the world by logical argumentation. His introduction of evil creatures being responsible for physical evil has the whiff of second-rate science fiction stories. Come now, natural evil may be necessary or unavoidable in the present state of our world, But this all-powerful God cannot actualize a world in which there are better natural laws, where humans and animals will not suffer, where nature will be congenial to the living things inhabiting that world? Surely the theists jest. And even more amusing is Platinga's introduction of evil demons, which we have just referred to. Why should evil demons have to have free will? They are not humans and are beyond salvation. In fact, they have nothing to do with being saved. So do they have free will that is in some way not in control of the all-powerful God? That is Platinga's contention, and it makes no sense. Platinga's argument fails. There are other explanations from theists concerning natural evil, and they are all easily disposed of. Theists insist that natural evil may be necessary for moral perfection, or that evil is a warning that greater evil will follow, and so on. What sort of a warning are natural evils? Tom Flynn cites genetic birth defects. What kind of warning is being born with such defects to a child, or even to his parents, many of whom lead morally upright lives? Are we to believe that God cannot warn humans in a more kindly, thoughtful manner? It would be less ambiguous and less destructive. He could merely announce his warning or send a heavenly messenger. As for natural evil being necessary for moral perfection, what is the value for thousands of children perishing in a tsunami? Has this helped them morally in some way? Will all parents be aided morally who lose those children, or will many be crushed and defeated in spirit? Such a powerful God could provide better alternatives for moral development, especially for the innocent. Of course, some theists believe in that old ditty, "With Adam's fall, we sinned all, including the children." Spare me. The moral perfection argument and the necessary warning argument in defense of evil fails. Atheists have rebutted the arguments for the existence of God with ease. The problem of evil in the world, compatible with an all-powerful and benevolent God, has not been satisfactorily explained by theists. It is time to take Occam's metaphorical razor up and scissor the God proposition from the theory. The only true logical explanation for evil in the world is that no God, creator, exists. We now return to the problem of unbelief, which is likely the strongest argument to date against the existence of God. Besides Drange, two important scholars, Daniel Howard Snyder and Paul K. Moser, among others, have explored this problem of divine hiddenness, unbelief allowed by God, and God's hidden purpose. These issues are entwined with the problem of evil and free will, and will be seen to overlap and entwine together at points. If God exists and loves humans, why has he remained hidden so long from so many people, and why are there so many unbelievers in the world? It is obviously in people's best interest to believe in God, and if God loves them as stated, why would he not act in a way to further their best interest, in other words, to believe in him? We are faced with a formidable difficulty once again. With the problem of evil, we have the question of why a loving God would not act to reduce or completely eliminate the amount of suffering in the world. With the problem of unbelief, we are faced with a deity who will apparently not act to allow people to believe in him. This fact reinforces the inescapable and rational conclusion of unbelievers that God does not exist. How else can we account for the fact that this God not only purportedly loves people, but wants them to come to a knowledge of truth? 1 Timothy 2:4 states clearly that it is God who wants all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. After all, this God not only wants this to happen, but is all-powerful. Since we have dealt with the free will defense and God not wanting to interfere with free will in the preceding section on the problem of evil, I will not belabor this mendacious argument from theists once again, but continue on with the issue of non-belief in the world. God could easily make himself known to people. He could perform miracles that could not be mistaken for natural phenomena. He could inspire men in the proper manner so they would write truly of him, and such writing could be disseminated all over the world. Such inspiration would provide a Bible free from contradictions and errors. Such a Bible would provide an original Old Testament and New Testament. Such a Bible would have correct prophecies. Such a Bible would have no mathematical, geographical, or scientific and cosmological errors. God could have provided preachers who preached the truth about him in such an inspired manner that all people would believe them. They could speak in all the languages of the earth. God could interrupt all the communication on the earth during prime time and announce the fact of his existence to all people. Oh gosh, God doesn't have to do all that. He is all-powerful. He could just make an announcement from the heavens to all of us, and that would solve the entire question. He will not, I can assure you. There are, according to figures, about 1 billion people around the world who do not believe in God. We have been told that God wants everyone to believe in him. Why then does he not provide them with good evidence, as we have half-jokingly suggested just now, to convince them? Of course, theists believe God has already done that, and they additionally state that their theist beliefs are not irrational. Despite their protestations, the fact remains that there is no good evidence for the existence of God. Let us even take the theists at their word that there is evidence. Well, there is apparently not enough evidence for over 1 billion people. If God would provide them in reality with the evidence that theists state or pretend to have, he would merely be making unbelievers aware that he exists. He would not be interfering with them any more than he does with the theists. He would be raising awareness up to the level of theists, who make no claim that God is interfering with them or abrogating their free will by the evidence they claim God has provided them. I mention the free will defense once again because it can be seen that the free will question is inseparable from the question of unbelief if one follows theistic reasoning. It can be seen that the defense of belief, the hiddenness of God, fails, both logically and practically. There are two more theistic defenses that completely fail that are intertwined with the question of unbelief in God. An important one is the afterlife. Theists claim that God will enlighten unbelievers about his existence in the afterlife. However, the Bible says that now is the day of salvation, 2 Corinthians 6, meaning that salvation comes from our life on earth, and that it is appointed for men to die once, and after that comes judgment, Hebrew 9:27. These statements seem to make clear that the requirements for salvation must be satisfied in this life. Therefore, this afterlife defense truly conflicts with what most theists, at least in the United States, believe. One has a chance at salvation only in this life. So if God does not help us with our unbelief here on earth, it seems that this so-called loving God will not extend salvation to us in the afterlife. And this question of the afterlife brings us to the totally non-explicable question of why two lives? Why has God set matters up so we humans are left pretty much on our own in this prior life, and then we are put into an afterlife where God reigns? Once again, the question is raised, if we are to be saved, why are we left on our own, unaware of what we need to know and believe? The entire assertion of an afterlife is inexplicable, unexplained, unsatisfactory, and irrational. Theists have a final last resort, a fallback position, as it were, concerning non-belief. They claim that God has a hidden purpose for permitting unbelief in him. They also make the claim concerning God's permitting evil in the world when their defense of it fails. Where is the proof to permit such claims? There is virtually none. On the contrary, there is nothing in scriptures or any other sacred Christian texts that support any such claims. As a matter of fact, scholars have found excellent biblical support for what we've repeated so many times in this lecture, that God wants what is best for people and wants them to be aware of the truth, which includes the truth of his existence. Once again, let us remember that the theists insist that God apparently wants us to love him. So the idea of a hidden purpose is counterintuitive to such a claim. Theists counter that it is completely logical for God to have a hidden purpose that would override his desire for humans' love and awareness of him. Their argument, however, is not logical and not based on any reasonable expectations. It is a weak rejoinder to atheologists' refutation of theist arguments for the existence of God. Hidden purpose fails. We have seen tonight an array of arguments to prove the existence of God, a hidden God who does not want to interfere with our free will by making us aware of him, and has a hidden purpose for not alleviating suffering in the world. The only logical conclusion is that there is no God, and such arguments are an insult to rational minds. I would like to end this lecture with an existential theist statement on evil and suffering in this world, and the putative reconciliation with such suffering when the previously hidden God reveals his purpose and creates happiness and peace for humans in the end. In Fyodor Dostoevsky's great novel, The Brothers Karamazov, 1880, the atheist brother Ivan confronts his younger Christian brother Alyosha with a question concerning evil in the world. I call on you, answer me. Imagine that you yourself are building an edifice of human destiny with the object of making people happy in the finale, of giving them peace and rest at last. But for that you must inevitably and unavoidably torture just one tiny creature and raise your edifice on that foundation of her unrequited tears. Would you agree to be the architect on such conditions? Tell me the truth. No, I would not agree, said Alyosha softly. The defenses for the hidden God, hidden purpose, unbelief, and evil in the world fail. Thank you so much for your attention this evening.